So in this video I'm going to be showing you how I made this end grain cutting board. You can see now that it's finished. This is my first end grain cutting board. I've made one other cutting board, but that was more of like a cheese board. Anyway, I wanted to do something a little bit different, so I came up with this way to cut the edges of the wood in order to make more of an intricate design on the top of it. And the reason I'm making this is because someone approached me probably about a month ago now, right before the holidays, and they had some really nice old beams. They have to be at least 8 by 8. One is oak and the other is really nice old growth southern pine. You just can't find stuff like that nowadays, so he said he would give me a couple of the beams in exchange for making him a cutting board. And barter is pretty much one of my most favorite ways to make stuff. Obviously, you need to make money to pay your bills, but I just really enjoy the act of exchanging and bartering when it comes to making. So I have a little bit of leeway in between projects because I'm waiting for some materials to be shipped. I figured I'd bust out this cutting board. If you know little to nothing about cutting boards, there's a program online that someone created for free for people to use for free that you can go on there and mess around with laying out specific species of wood, what sizes, what depths. And if you've never made a cutting board before or you want to play around with cool designs, I really recommend downloading that program and messing around with it. It is free, but whenever I do use free programs online, there is a PayPal donation button, and you really should be throwing, you know, a couple bucks, $5 or so at these guys. He did make it and put it up there for free, so it's only kind of nice to return the favor. If everyone who downloaded it gave him a couple bucks, that's a decent amount of money. So I'll put a link to that in the description. I have played around with that program before, like I said, but I didn't use it to finalize this design. Mainly because I'm using all scrap and I'm kind of limited to the scrap I had. So I pulled out some woods that would work well for a cutting board. I have some cherry over here, some maple in the middle. This is actually birch, which looks a lot like maple, but it's two different species, and then a stack of walnut. So the walnut is only about a little less than 3/4. So that is going to be the dimension I'm going to use for all this other stuff, because you're going to want that to be the same. So I'm going to mill all this stuff to about 5/8 of an inch, which would be 0.625. Now, because my slats are going to be so skinny, that means I'm going to need more of them once they're turned on their edge in order to get the length of my board. My rough length is going to be 16 long by 13-ish wide, and that's a little oversized because you're going to be losing some dimension when you plane these and cut them down. So that's kind of the rough gauge I'm going for. Now, these are 3 good choices of woods, maple probably being the most popular for end grain cutting boards because the wood itself is fine grained and very dense. Something like I have a piece of red oak here is not ideal for cutting boards. The grain is very open. You can see the difference in the 2 edges, how much more open the pores of the wood of the oak are versus the closed fine grain of the maple. If you use something like oak, you're kind of setting yourself up for water and bacteria to be absorbed at a much faster rate than this maple, and it could lead to, if you're not great at cleaning things, bacteria problems, but also with all that water, your glue joints coming apart. Now for the design, you'll see I'm trying something a little different, but the general rule of thumb, and this is where you could practice on that computer program, is if your slats are all symmetrical and the same size, you're going to get a checkerboard pattern at the end. When you start making different size slats and offsetting your boards, it's when you get the more interesting kind of intricate designs. After planning everything to the same thickness, this is what the layout I have is going to look like. And some of these I'm going to have to trim because, like I said, I'm going to have to glue this up in 2 sections because I just didn't have enough long pieces for one. So there's my extra stock over there. It goes without saying, I planed these, but you didn't see me joint them because most of this lumber I've either used for other projects and it was the tail end of pieces, so it was already jointed, or someone has just given me this maple, and this maple I believe was ordered from an online retailer which finishes the edges for you already because they were fairly perfect, so I didn't have to do that. But if you have to joint your boards, I do have a video that's always in my description showing you how to make a jig for jointing boards on a table saw if you don't have one. So the original dimensions I had for my board, which would give me about a 12-inch depth, are on this sheet of paper in order of which piece of wood. But I ended up adding 3/4 of an inch to all of this and coming up with new dimensions, and those are the sizes I ended up cutting. And that is because you might have saw in the video I added this piece of poplar in there, and I'm going to use this to make a jig. And what I want to do is cut grooves in these and then like arrowheads in these and connect them like chevrons down the line, so each piece will connect into the other by about 3/4 of an inch, which is why I had that extra piece. And that is kind of a design I want to play around with for the top of this board, this chevron look. So this might be something I end up regretting because it's making these cutting boards, which is kind of a simple process, more difficult, but I'm going to test it out on this piece of poplar and get all of this set up before I start cutting my actual lumber. Now they do sell a router jig. They do sell router bits that will cut both of those pieces for you perfectly, but it's like $80 for the set, so it's not something I wanted to put the money up front for. So in order to start the process of putting that chevron in the ends of all of these, I found center of that piece of poplar, and this ended up being a little bit thinner than 3/4, so center was a little bit more than 3/8 of an inch. And then I was originally going to come up to 3/4, but that would have been a pretty big chunk, so I came to 5/8 and marked a perpendicular line to my center. Then with this bevel that has a digital gauge, I went and was able to put this on that center line, line it up with my edge. You could see I marked that 45 on either side. So that's basically what I want to cut out. So now I could take this to my table saw and get that cut out perfect and then slide all of my pieces through. So it's going to be hard to see on the camera probably, but what I did was I put a little shim on here. This is a piece of plywood. I use plywood because it's going to be the flattest, straightest thing most likely in my shop. I don't have any thick pieces of MDF, so this nicer grade of plywood works well. Clamped it to my fence, and then I set my blade at a 45. So now with it lined up, it's going to cut right through this first line. Now the blade's lower than what I want, but in order to get this corner perfect, I'm going to creep up on that cut. So now with this setup is my best chance at getting these as identical as possible, because I could cut this bottom one, flip this whole piece over, and cut that other side from the other end, and it will be a perfectly symmetrical cut. So I'm going to practice on this piece to get that chevron, and as soon as I have it, I could send all of my stock through. So I think that's going to work. You could see the piece that I had removed. It fits back in there perfectly. Now the one plus side to that situation is if I can't get the marks I'm going to have to cut on the other end that are going to be these little triangles to line up in these grooves, I could always just take the cutouts I have and swap them around and then glue the whole piece together like that. It'll be somewhat of the same effect, just a different color. So that is a huge plus to this. So I have all of those first cuts out of my pieces. I went back to my scrap, and to figure out that mark is going to be really simple. I'm just going to use the cut I have in here. I'll flip it over like this, line it up with the edge, and then mark it on the inside, and once again creep up on those cuts until I have it perfect in there. I'm going to have to move my jig and everything, obviously, but if I could get this piece to fit in here perfectly, since these were cut all off of this, in theory it should all line up. So that is the bit I have to cut out of this one, and this is what I came up with to do that. So what I did was I shimmed out already this fence that I had shimmed another 1/2 inch with a piece of ply, and I cut out a little window to allow the fence to move over top the blade. That way I'm actually be cutting the top side first, flipping it, and then cutting the bottom. Now the reason I made these the way I did, it would probably be easier to make it like this and slide this over and cut the bottom. But since all of my pieces are different widths, every single time I switched a species, I would have to adjust the fence. And as soon as you adjust the fence, that leaves room for micro errors. So by making this fence setup, which really didn't take that long, kind of ensured that as long as I apply pressure and these are jointed properly and planed properly, they're going to get as close to symmetrical as possible. So I'm going to send this piece through and see how well it fits in that original piece of poplar. So that is that joint. It looks like it's going to fit perfectly. So before I cut all of these, I'm going to redo my math. Since this only ended up being 5/8 of an inch, I think about, I'll have to check if it actually is 5/8 of an inch. I'm probably going to have to take a little bit of material off the ends of all of these, otherwise this board will be too wide, and the width is based on the opening of my plane, so if it's too wide I won't be able to plane this board. But the other thing is I cut these little mouths on all of my pieces. However, on the top side of the board you won't need that one end because it will be the edge of the board. So 2 of these pieces of cherry, I think I'm going to have to cut down to maybe even a smaller size. I'll have to see. I cleaned up the inside of that chevron with a chisel and clamped this set together. Now I have my other set over here, and these two pieces are my long pieces, so I'll have to trim those and use those in the other stack as well, but I should have enough to make at least one board. And then you could see on the edge how that all lines up, and when this is going to be flipped, you're going to have just a nice chevron pattern on that end grain. There really are no gaps. I'm probably going to clean this up even a little bit more before I glue this together. Just go through and lightly sand everything. In order to make up for the mishap on the end, I'm going to use a piece of that walnut plug on the end as well. Since this cherry will always be at the edge of the board, it will just be a nice detail at the edge of the board. And then on this side, since I cut that as well, this right now is exactly 13 inches. So I didn't cut down any of these pieces before I sent them through like I thought I might have to. And I'll end up trimming this because 13 inches will just fit through my planer. So once it's done, I'll just trim up the edges in order to get this to fit in that planer. So this is the stack I've cleaned up. You can see on the top there's literally no gaps, and that's without any clamps or anything on it, and that's what I want before glue. This is the stack I haven't done yet. You could see before you clean it up there are gaps across the piece. So I'm going to show you how I cleaned it up on this one. I'm just going to do a couple pieces, and then right before I glue these together, I am going to trim off this one part on the edge of the maple just so that my clamps won't get messed up because of that edge. So the first thing I do is clean up the pointed end with some 120 grit sandpaper, and there are some spots where you have ridges from your table saw. Cutting all these 45s in there, sometimes these pieces want to move around and you don't always get a flat cut, so I'll hand plane off any high spots, and then I put it back in the bench and really clean up this groove and sand that with 120 as well, and then these pieces really fit into place nicely. With all those edges cleaned up, you could see sliding them back together leaves almost no gap. And those are still the ones I have to do. So I'm just going to work my way up, doing each one, and then these are ready for glue. I have my other board cleaned up, and now I'm going to glue them together. I'm using Titebond 2 for this. I usually use Titebond 3 for a lot of stuff, but I'm just about out of it. But I do have Titebond 2. It's just as good, and I believe both are FDA approved for food use, so some glues won't be, so make sure the back of your glue bottle says it is. So I have two cauls already set up over here, and those are just when you apply clamping pressure on either end of this, it's going to want to bow. Naturally, it's just going to want to. I know some people say if you clamp on top and bottom, that won't happen. I've never had a ton of success with that technique, so I just use cauls, and those will keep everything perfectly flat as this dries. It should be fairly easy to glue up because I'm just going to put glue in all of those valleys, and the chevrons should actually kind of help me keep this aligned, almost like biscuits, and I'm going to let these set up overnight. So these set up overnight, and I'm ready to take the clamps off. and you can see they're pretty clear. Last night I let the glue set up for about a half an hour. That time really depends on what the temperature is like. Since it's a little chillier, this glue took a little bit longer to set up. And then I took a chisel, and you're able to just kind of scrape off those glue joints. The glue comes off pretty easily, and it just makes cleaning these up much easier if you don't have the glue on there. Especially if you're using Titebond 3, because Titebond 3 is just much harder to sand than 1 or 2.